Monday mornings were always heavy at the company, not because of the work, we all had learned to live with the grind, but because of how performative they'd become. Everyone in that boardroom smiled like their bonuses depended on it. Maybe they did. I walked in with my notes tucked into a leather folio, the one I'd carried every January since the day the EU compliance trip became my responsibility. I sat in the same chair, 3 seats from the head of the table, where I could see everything and be seen by no one. That morning, I was scheduled to present updates on the upcoming Berlin license renewal. I had memorized the deadlines, the regulatory updates, the audit response language, because I always did. Because that's how I kept us in business overseas for the last 20 years. Cressida, my brother-in-law, and our newly minted COO stood up with a grin too polished to be genuine. "No more of these expensive vacations to Europe," he said, waving his hand toward my section of the agenda. "Zoom exists for a reason, folks." Laughter. Nervous, scattered, but present. A few heads turned toward me, then away just as quickly. I didn't laugh. I smiled, because what else was I supposed to do? In front of the whole room, I adjusted the pen in my hand and nodded slightly, as if to say, "Duly noted." They always dress it up as efficiency, but that wasn't a joke. It was a message. You're not as essential as you think. That sentence had been delivered to women like me in 10,000 different ways, through 1,000 different mouths, and it always landed like a paper cut across pride. Back at my desk, I couldn't focus on the spreadsheet in front of me. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, but my mind had already drifted, to last spring, to Berlin. Meeting rooms that smelled like coffee and stale paper. Regulatory officers with sharp eyes and no time for American arrogance. I remembered sitting across from a German trade official who didn't speak much English and didn't have to. We understood each other through a shared language of detail, punctuality, and mutual respect. A handshake there had more weight than a signed MOU back here. And now it was being referred to as a vacation. The quote came to me out of nowhere. In every joke, there's a little truth. In every insult, a whole truth. It wasn't just Cressida's voice I heard in that boardroom. It was the company's new identity speaking. Younger, louder, dismissive of things they didn't understand, but still eager to replace. Later that day, I logged into our internal travel portal. I wasn't looking to book anything. I needed to confirm something, and it didn't take long. My name had been quietly removed from the Berlin delegation. In my place, listed under Strategic Communications, was Cressida's wife, Jenna. Jenna, who had never once sat through a compliance review. Jenna, who once asked me if regulatory was a product line. I stood up and walked over to Lauren, our admin. She looked up at me like I'd just caught her hiding a Christmas present. "Lauren," I said evenly, "did the Q1 assignments change?" She bit her lip. "They said, I think Cressida mentioned it was to streamline things. New faces, new tone, you know." I nodded. "Of course, thanks for letting me know." I walked back to my office slowly. No drama, just adjustment. Inside, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the yellow sticky note I had kept from last year. I scribbled over the date, added the new one, March 3rd, license due. That evening, Leora knocked softly on my open door. She's one of our newer analysts, bright but still learning the nuances of internal politics. "You're not going this year?" she asked, trying to mask her surprise. "Nope," I replied with a slight smile. "But you always handle Berlin." "Not my call this time." I kept my tone light, not because I wasn't angry, but because I knew she didn't deserve to carry my bitterness. Her eyebrows furrowed, and I saw the first seed of understanding plant itself in her mind. When she left, I stared at my screen for a long while. The flight confirmation for Berlin still sat in my inbox. I clicked it open, then hovered over the cancel button. "You don't warn toddlers juggling knives," I whispered to myself. "You move sharp objects out of reach and let them learn." I hit cancel. Then I opened a folder on my desktop and renamed it, Just in Case. Night had fallen by the time I walked down to the parking garage. My heels echoed in the empty stairwell, each step a quiet resignation. Before starting my car, I pulled out my phone to check emails one last time. The subject line from corporate communications read, Q1, Travel Optimization Initiative, confirmed. No sign of my name anywhere. No acknowledgement, not even a mention. I locked the screen and let the silence settle around me like a second skin. And that was the last time they mistook my silence for surrender. A week passed, but the echo of that meeting hadn't gone anywhere. It lingered like the smell of old coffee in the boardroom, hard to pinpoint, impossible to ignore. When I walked into the office Monday morning, the air felt cooler than usual, not because of the temperature, but because something had shifted, subtly, permanently. I opened my email and saw a company-wide travel update for Q1. I wasn't expecting anything new, but habit is hard to break. My eyes scanned the list anyway, line by line. Paris, Toronto, Seoul, and then Berlin, Jenna. Her name was listed as Strategic Delegate, EU Outreach. Not even a joke, just a confirmation of what I already knew. I clicked into the portal. My Berlin itinerary had been wiped entirely. No alert, no cancellation notice. Just vanished. A Slack message pinged. I glanced over. All travel adjustments approved via Cressida. Let me know if you have any new cities next quarter. Son, I stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before I closed it. The emoji stung more than the words, the kind of upbeat dismissal that hides a knife in cotton candy. They hadn't forgotten me. That would require intention. No, this was worse. This was them moving on as if I was never there to begin with. I didn't feel rage. Not yet. Just a hollow acknowledgement that something real had been erased. Not in a dramatic gesture, but in a dozen small, calculated omissions. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle. The room had never felt quieter. A few hours later, a company newsletter popped up in everyone's inbox. I opened it, expecting some fluff piece about community initiatives or maybe a photo from the holiday mixer. What I saw stopped me cold. There it was. A wide-angle photo of the executive team gathered around the new product prototype, all smiles and handshakes. I had been in that photo. I remembered exactly where I stood, left corner, third row, blazer and scarf, laughing with Lauren. But in this version, cropped, meticulously, seamlessly, like I was never even part of the scene. I pulled out my phone, opened the original image I had saved, and placed it side by side with the published version. The edges were cleaner than any Photoshop job I'd seen. Someone had taken real care, surgical care, to cut me out. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stared, jaw locked. Then, without a word, I created a new folder on my desktop. Edits. I dragged both versions of the image inside. Saved. Dated. Archived. A soft knock broke the quiet. Lyora peeked in, holding a coffee she hadn't bought for herself. They changed the Berlin plan, and didn't include you? She asked cautiously. I gestured for her to sit. Streamlining, that's the official line. She looked genuinely puzzled. But who's handling the submission package? I thought only you had the portal access. I shrugged and took a sip from my mug. You'll have to ask Cressida. The words came out cool, detached. I wasn't being coy. I was done rescuing people from decisions they made without me. Lyora didn't respond right away. She just nodded slowly, like she was connecting dots she hadn't even realized were on the same page. After she left, I opened my inbox again, not to respond to anyone, but to start quietly organizing. Emails, memos, version histories, Slack exports, anything with a timestamp or a trail. People assume deletion is the cleanest way to hide a mistake. What they forget is that every system has a memory. And I had learned long ago that the key to survival wasn't noise. It was receipts. I wasn't panicking. I was preparing. By the time the sun dipped behind the parking lot lights, I had already archived 3 weeks' worth of internal documentation. Names, changes, digital footprints. Not because I planned to use them, but because I wanted the option. I checked the time, stood up, stretched. The office was nearly empty. A few screens glowed in the distance, muted voices over Zoom calls fading into silence. Back at my desk, I clicked open my calendar. There, nestled between team syncs and meaningless leadership webinars, was a recurring event I had never missed. Berlin license renewal trip, March. I hovered over it. One click, delete, confirm. No sigh, no second thoughts. Some deletions leave a blank space, others leave consequences. 2 days after I canceled the Berlin trip, I stayed late at the office, not because I had to, but because I needed the quiet. There's a different kind of truth that surfaces when a place empties out. Fluorescent lights hum louder. The silence presses in. You stop being part of the machine and start seeing how it moves without you. I opened my sent folder and scrolled until I found the email I'd sent weeks ago. Subject line, 2024 EU Compliance Packet, critical deadlines attached. It was thorough. Attachments, escalation points, contact references. I had even CC'd Taylor, Cressida too. Not a single reply. No confirmation. Not even a passive thumbs-up emoji. I reread it, looking for anything I might have missed. A line that could have sounded vague or uncertain. There wasn't one. It was clean, clear, but ignored. In compliance, silence is never neutral. It's either oversight or sabotage. This wasn't neglect. It was a calculated decision to leave me in the dark. I leaned back, pulled open my drawer, and tapped the edge of the desk. It was something my father used to do when words didn't cut it. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. My anger didn't slam doors. It archived. I opened the license portal. Locked. I tried my backup login. Also denied. Curious now, I accessed the shared drive where I kept my personal compliance calendar. The color-coded masterpiece I'd used for 6 years straight. Gone. A single pop-up blinked on screen. User not authorized. Contact administrator. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable I couldn't help myself. You took me out of the system before you took me out of the meeting, I murmured, like I was reciting the punchline to a joke only I understood. The next day, there was a small team meeting, one of those syncs Cressida liked to host for optics. Taylor was leading it, her slides filled with buzzwords and boxes. I sat in the back, next to the coffee urn. She was presenting the new license timeline. Her voice had that upbeat tone of someone trying to sell expertise they didn't earn. And here we've updated the milestone tracker to ensure regulatory handoffs align with submission deadlines, she said, clicking confidently. I recognized it immediately. It was the flowchart I'd built in September. Even the arrows were identical. Cressida nodded from across the room, arms folded, that same smug approval glued to his face like he'd coached her himself. I caught Leora's eyes. She was across the table, not saying anything, but the tension in her jaw said enough. She knew. They all knew. I didn't speak. Not yet. I wasn't going to bail them out of their own choices. If they wanted to repurpose my work, they'd also have to absorb the consequences. Later that afternoon, an internal memo arrived in my inbox. Subject line, Operational Streamlining, Role Consolidation Overview. The email never mentioned me by name. Instead, it described reduced overlap in redundant responsibilities and modernized ownership assignments. No job title, no credit, just airbrushed out. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I opened the IT request log. They had submitted the access revocation order 10 days before the official reorg announcement, 10 days before anyone looked me in the eye and said the word streamline. I sat there, rereading the line. Request to remove Seraphine R. from Access Group, EU Ops Core. Erasure is not always cruel, I said aloud, quoting a line I once heard Brené Brown deliver at a summit. Sometimes it's strategic. So I printed everything. The revocation emails, the calendar deletions, the untouched packet I'd sent. I bound them together, page by page, and slid them into a folder I labeled Ghost Ops. No rage, no panic, just process. That night, I stayed behind again. I liked the quiet. No one watched me. No one interrupted. They had already decided I didn't exist. Before I left, I glanced at the sticky note still pinned on the corner of my screen. March 3rd, Berlin license due. I didn't pull it down. I didn't cross it out. I just picked up a Sharpie and wrote underneath it in firm capital letters. Not my problem. Let them find out. And find out they would, but not the way they thought. Friday afternoons in our building always had a strange stillness to them, the kind that settled into the corners like dust. I'd just finished organizing my final archive folders when I heard the lightest knock on the doorframe. It wasn't a knock, really, more like a signal. Lyora stepped in without a word and handed me a folded sticky note. No preamble, no eye contact. She just placed it on my desk and turned to leave, as if this was the kind of communication we now needed to survive. I opened it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. "They're waiting for you to fight. Don't." I folded it carefully and slipped it into my blazer pocket. I didn't need to say anything. She already knew I understood. That's the thing about people like us. We've been trained to read between lines since we were young enough to sit at the dinner table and sense tension behind a forced smile. My thoughts looped around one conclusion. They didn't want honesty. They wanted a reaction they could weaponize, and I wasn't about to give them that show. Come Monday, the tone of the office had shifted again. A cross-departmental meeting had been called with no agenda provided, always a red flag. By 9:03, we were all seated in the glass boardroom, the city skyline casting wide shadows across the table. The air smelled like nervous cologne and reheated ambition. Cressida stood at the front with a slide deck that looked like it had been made overnight. Buzzwords floated behind him like confetti. Agility, realignment, cross-functional efficiency. He clicked to a chart and began speaking. "There have been some transition pains in Q1, he said, in that trademark tone of his, part TED Talk, part used car salesman, but we've taken decisive steps to address role redundancies, increase velocity, and better serve our global compliance strategy." Someone asked about the EU licensing gap. Cressida didn't flinch. "We've restructured those responsibilities. Seraphine hasn't been part of that workflow since Q4. The sentence landed like a dull thud. Taylor, seated 3 chairs down, froze just for a second. Just enough to give herself away. I didn't say a word. I didn't even look surprised. Instead, I mentally filed that moment under a label I'd come to rely on. Receipts to remember. If they lie in public, I reminded myself, document in private. After the meeting, as I waited for the elevator, Taylor appeared beside me. She didn't speak right away. "I didn't know they would put it like that," she mumbled, eyes trained on the floor tiles. I replied without turning my head. "They didn't. He did." She looked like she wanted to say more but didn't. And I didn't make it easy. Sometimes the most painful part of betrayal is how silently it unfolds. Once back in my office, I shut the door and opened my laptop. I began cataloging everything. First, the date I sent the original EU renewal brief, timestamped, PDF'd. Second, the internal request that revoked my access to the EU dashboard, dated 2 weeks before the official transition. Third, the day Taylor was copied on the license deadlines. Fourth, the memo from HR about streamlining overlapping workflows. I renamed each file methodically. Timeline A, role transfer, C, silent revocation, F. They weren't evidence, not yet. They were just facts, and facts, when lined up, tend to speak louder than accusations. Around 10 p.m., just as I was shutting down, an email pinged from Lyora. Subject: "They're lost. March 3rd is close. They haven't filed. They don't even know what goes where." I stared at the screen, then typed one line in response. "Let the silence speak." The next morning, I walked past the boardroom and paused outside. Through the glass, I saw the executive team gathered around the table, laughing. Cressida was holding court with some story that had everyone grinning. I caught the words "compliance crisis averted" float through the glass. A joke, no doubt. Probably at my expense. I stepped closer, still unnoticed. The light hit the glass just enough to cast my reflection in the corner of their view. A ghost, visible only if they chose to see it. I placed my phone face down on the floor next to the doorframe and tapped the screen to start recording. Some laughs aren't free, and that one would cost them more than they ever budgeted for. It was a crisp Monday morning, the kind where you could feel the weight of unfinished business clinging to the walls like humidity. I walked into the team sink a few minutes early, long enough to choose the farthest seat in the conference room, close to the window, close to the exit. I had no intention of contributing. I already knew what was coming. Taylor stood at the head of the room, beaming, fingers fluttering nervously over her laptop as she queued up a slideshow. I watched her with the detached interest of someone inspecting their own signature forged on a check. "We've been refining our risk metrics," she started, clicking to a dashboard filled with colorful bar graphs and bullet points. "This is our new visual framework for license renewal timelines and compliance audits across the EU portfolio." "New?" I tilted my head slightly. The font was mine. The structure was mine. The format, the language, the order, it was mine. Down to the faded watermark on the corner of slide 4. They hadn't even bothered to remove it. I let her speak another 3 minutes before I raised my hand. Calm, deliberate. "Taylor," I said softly. "That table on slide 4, do you know what the color code indicates?" She froze. Blinked. Green is for compliance met. Yellow is pending. Red is overdue, yes," I nodded. "But did you know those colors were assigned based on tiered regulator strictness, not date?" Cressida shifted in his chair across the room. I wasn't aware," Taylor muttered, eyes flicking to the screen, then back to me. I stood, walked to the AV cabinet, and plugged in a flash drive without asking permission. Clicked twice. Opened a report titled EU Compliance Risk Index V1.2. On the screen, the same slides appeared, this time with metadata at the bottom. Author, Seraphine R. Timestamp, November 14th, 9:03 a.m. Every bullet, every color, every phrase mirrored hers. I stepped back and let the silence soak the room. Cressida cleared his throat. "Let's not make this personal," he said, giving his best corporate peacemaker tone. I turned to face the group, not him. "It's not personal, it's procedural. And since we're aligning around accuracy, I thought the team should see where the data originated." My voice didn't rise. It never had to. I handed Taylor a printed document. "You were CC'd on this. March 1st. If I missed an update, feel free to let me know." Taylor looked at the paper, cheeks reddening. I'm sorry. I didn't know they were going to use it." "They didn't use it," I corrected. "They presented it as new." Cressida leaned forward. "All internal documents belong to the company, Seraphine. We're all building on shared resources. Ownership isn't the issue," I said, still facing the room. "Integrity is." A few eyes darted to each other. No one argued. It wasn't about credit anymore. It was about principle. I didn't need applause. I needed to make it clear that silence wasn't the same as consent. Back in my office, I slid the flash drive into my personal archive and renamed the folder Proof Chain Reinforced. I added today's meeting recording, titled it Unspoken Correction. Receipts, not reactions. That's how you survive when people rewrite the story around you. Around 3:42 p.m., just as I was closing up, a Slack ping popped up on my screen. Q1 legal review rescheduled. Cressida added you back to the invite. I didn't click it. I didn't respond. I just leaned back in my chair and smirked. But I wasn't coming back to fix what they broke. I was coming to let it fall. The first Slack message came in before I'd even turned on my second monitor. "Portal down," it read, followed by another seconds later. "Customs won't clear the batch. Anyone else seeing this?" I didn't respond. I sipped my coffee and watched the panic bloom in real time. By 8:23 a.m., the EU team thread was on fire. Shipment delays, account lockouts, error codes no one understood but everyone feared. Taylor's status had her listed as OOO, some yoga retreat, if I remembered right. Of course. Cressida chimed in with clipped authority. "Loop in Seraphine. She might have legacy info on the compliance backend." Legacy info. They couldn't even say the word expertise. I minimized the thread and opened my inbox. Sat back, watched them scramble through the digital mess they'd made. The very fire I had warned them about weeks ago was now licking their heels, and they still had the audacity to reach for the fire extinguisher they threw out. The internal system errors escalated by mid-morning. The EU license had expired 3 days prior, March 3rd. I knew that date by heart. I had circled it twice on every calendar since December. Apparently, no one else had. Red notifications lit up the screen. Compliance violation, EU Trade Act 4.3. Incoming and outgoing shipments blocked. Clients calling. Logistics halted. Indira, our CEO, tagged the legal team in a flurry of back-to-back messages. My phone buzzed. Email from Cressida. Can you advise? I didn't even open it. Instead, I opened the folder on my desktop labeled Camera Logs. I'd started using my webcam to record full workdays after the Access debacle. Not because I was paranoid, because I was realistic. I scrolled back to a file from January 18th. Hit play. There I was, on screen, time-stamped, emailing Cressida and Taylor, highlighting the urgency of renewing our EU certification. Beside me on the desk, a printed checklist, post-its, an open compliance manual, every move clear, every step logged. I paused the clip, took a screenshot, saved it, then watermarked the full video. Do not delete. I leaned back and whispered to myself, the moment you document truth, it stops being emotional and becomes executable. Around noon, Indira called, direct line. Did you know this would happen? She asked. I knew what would happen if they didn't listen. A pause. You could have pushed harder. I breathed in slowly. I wasn't authorized to. Remember? She didn't respond right away. We're in crisis mode. I said nothing. You're not going to help? I'm not going to fix something they broke on purpose. Cold, yes, but not cruel. There's a difference. That evening, I stayed late again. The office thinned out, lights dimmed, my screen glowed like a lighthouse for ghosts. I opened a new folder, Reactive Damage Control. Dropped in the latest emails from finance, $500,000 fine confirmed. Legal flagged an additional $80,000 in exposure if trade deadlines weren't renegotiated by the end of the week. Cressida sent another message just before 8 p.m. Let's realign workflows. I didn't respond, just dragged it into the folder and renamed it Too Little, Too Late. I was about to shut down when one last message came through, a secure channel from our EU regulatory partner. Subject: Termination of license account. Body: Due to continued non-compliance and lapsed engagement, we are discontinuing your active trade license effective immediately. Further fines to be assessed pending review. I read the message twice, then a third time, and I whispered, just loud enough to hear myself. And the storm begins. It was March 6th. The all-hands call was scheduled for 10 a.m., but by 9:50, I was already logged in, muted, camera off, watching the participants trickle into the digital room one by one. Little gray circles blinking to life. Little names with little faces. All of them ready to be fed the script. Some knew what was coming. Most didn't. Cressida, of course, took the lead. His screen shared seamlessly, as always, his voice smooth, calculated, with just enough faux vulnerability to seem leadership-ready. We've faced our share of turbulence this quarter, he began. But turbulence is a sign that we're moving forward, fast and fearlessly. This is not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. I almost laughed. His slides scrolled like a parade of empty catchphrases. Crisis agility. Operational reset. Lean rebuild. Then it came. Slide 18. Title: Regulatory Recovery Framework. And underneath it, 3 bullet points, word for word, lifted from the report I had sent to legal 4 months ago. Not paraphrased, not restructured, copied, pasted. I didn't need to scroll to the bottom corner to know what I'd find there, but I did anyway. Document prepared by C. Whitman. And just like that, the man who'd stripped me of my access, my authority, and my title now wore my work like a tailor-fit suit. In the chat window, someone typed, "Didn't Seraphine draft that playbook?" It disappeared within 10 seconds, moderator removed, but not before I screenshotted it. It joined a growing collection in my folder titled Credit Theft. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen this playbook before. Erase quietly, repackage loudly, and stand in the spotlight like you built the stage yourself. But it wasn't about stealing ideas anymore. It was about rewriting legacy. After the call ended, I opened my local archive, navigated to the folder where I'd saved every version of the EU compliance strategy since November. I clicked through the metadata, edit logs, original authorship tags, submission timestamps. My initials were everywhere. They weren't just watermarks, they were fingerprints. I compressed it all into one encrypted zip file and named it Hero Facade Destroyed Zip. It wasn't revenge, it was proof. Around noon, I stepped out for lunch, deciding against the usual salad bar in the lobby. I needed air, something different. I ended up at a small place 5 blocks away. I was halfway through a lukewarm soup when I opened Instagram just out of habit, and there it was. Jenna, Cressida's wife, Liv. "Celebration lunch with my favorite crew," she sang, holding her phone too close to her face. "We made it through the fire. Work hard, play harder." Behind her, champagne flutes clinked. Cressida sat at the head of a private booth, grinning like a man who dodged a bullet. They were celebrating. While the company hemorrhaged clients and hemorrhaged money, they were toasting resilience. I turned the volume down and kept watching anyway, not because I wanted to, but because it reminded me who they were when no one was looking. Some people light matches behind you and call it warmth. An hour later, back at my desk, Leora texted, "Did you see the stream? People are furious. The team's chat is lit up." I replied with a single line. "Let them finish dancing. The music's about to stop." And I meant it. That evening, just as I was about to shut down for the night, an email landed in my inbox, forwarded by a friend in legal. Subject, Emergency Board Review, scheduled. Date, Thursday, 8 o'clock a.m. Header, Operational Negligence Review, Compliance Chain Failure. I read it twice, then again, slower. A smile crept across my face. Small, quiet, deliberate. Because sometimes the executioner walks in with a grin, never knowing they're the one sentenced. The boardroom was already full when I walked in. Legal on the left, finance on the right. Indira at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Cressida sat 2 chairs down, legs crossed, fingers dancing lightly on his pen, like he was waiting to host a dinner party, not answer for a $500,000 loss. I took my usual seat at the far end, back row, corner, near the wall. My presence, as always, was part of the scenery. Convenient to forget. Hard to erase when the light hit just right. The screen flickered on. A spreadsheet filled the display. Color-coded, sobering. Indira didn't waste time. "This," she began, tapping the pointer on a bright red cell, "is the cost of missed compliance. $500,000 in regulatory fines, 3 canceled European partnerships, and a 24% drop in cross-border operations since Q1 began." Silence swallowed the room. Cressida leaned forward, clasping his hands in front of him, tone syrupy smooth. "We've been transitioning workflows aggressively," he said. "This is part of recalibrating efficiency. Inevitably, turbulence surfaces during innovation." I wondered how many times he'd practiced that line in front of a mirror. I could practically hear the TED Talk intro in his head. My gaze remained steady, my expression neutral. As the meeting wore on, he circled back to Berlin. "We still have a window," he offered. "If we send someone to Berlin next week, we might be able to negotiate a hold on the penalty." And then he turned to me. "Seraphine, if you could just take a quick trip." "No." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look away. I just said it. He blinked. "I just meant, you removed me from the process," I said calmly. "Remember? You could have heard a paperclip fall." One person cleared their throat, somewhere near finance. Taylor stared at the table. "You can't ask someone to fix the house after you've burned their tools," I added. He didn't respond. His mouth twitched, but no words followed. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. Sealed, clean, no creases. I slid it down the table toward Indira. "My resignation," I said. "Effective 2 months ago. I was waiting for today." Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She opened it, scanned the document, then passed it to the general counsel beside her. Cressida shifted in his chair, that confidence he wore like a tailored coat. It was unraveling at the seams now. I stood, no drama, no raised pitch, just clarity. You didn't want my presence, I said to the room. Now you don't have it. You didn't want my expertise. Now you can feel its absence. Still no one spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence was confession enough. I gave Indira a single nod and turned to leave. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, voices erupted. Not shouting, just panic. Scrambling. She has all the documentation, legal said, loud enough for it to reach the hallway. We've been relying on her process. We just rebranded it, finance added. I walked slowly, each step deliberate. It wasn't the sound of my heels echoing down the corridor that stayed with them. It was the sound of the room cracking behind me. At the elevator, my phone buzzed. Leora, you left with the building still shaking. I smiled to myself. On the drive home, the March sun was finally warming the windshield. The city moved around me, clueless to what had just collapsed inside that glass fortress of ego and jargon. I stopped at a red light. My phone buzzed again. An email from Indira. Can we speak privately? I stared at the screen for a long moment, then I tapped delete. Because I wasn't walking away from chaos, I was leaving it exactly where it belonged. The house was silent. I'd left the office hours earlier, but the noise of that boardroom still hummed under my skin. In my home office, the cup of tea I poured when I walked in had gone untouched. It sat beside me, cooling just like the aftermath of what I'd done. My phone buzzed again. Second client had pulled their contract. First one was this morning, quiet exit, no confrontation. This one was louder. They copied the whole sales team and ended with, "We'll revisit next fiscal year, pending stability." An executive friend from the other side of the company sent me a text. Today shook the whole top floor. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I turned the phone face down and let my mind drift, not to the chaos they were left with, but to how long I'd carried the weight they pretended didn't exist. An hour later, Indira's name popped up in my inbox. Subject line, following up. Her message was carefully crafted, an apology buried beneath measured phrasing. I wanted to step in. I really did. But if I had, it would have made things worse. You were right. I knew, but I couldn't act publicly. I hope you can understand. Understand. I stared at the blinking cursor as if it might type a response for me. Then I closed the window. When they choose silence over truth, you stop needing their voice. I didn't need her confession. I'd lived its consequence. Later that afternoon, another message came through, this one unexpected. The subject line was simply, Danke. It was from our longtime European partner. We just learned what happened. Know this, we stayed in the contract all these years because of you. Not the logo, not the structure, you. A pause in the middle of the message, then one final line. One handshake from you meant more than 1,000 signatures from them. I read it twice, then I printed it, walked over to the bulletin board above my desk, and pinned it where the light could hit it. It was the first time in days that something genuine cut through the fog. I smiled, not the smirk I'd been using like armor, but a small, quiet smile. The kind that said, I was never wrong about who I was. In the early evening, Leora messaged, they're doing damage control now, emergency town halls, HR scripts. Cressida didn't show up on the last call, but everyone knows, they know who let it fall. Another ping, this time from someone in HR. A forwarded screenshot from the anonymous employee survey that had just closed. We didn't lose Seraphine. We gave her a reason to leave. I copied the sentence into my journal. Underneath it, I wrote 2 words. Damn right. Just before sunset, the doorbell rang. No one had said they were coming. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there was a small package on the mat. No return address. Inside, my old office nameplate, still polished, wrapped in bubble wrap like it was glass. Maybe it was... Underneath it, a single note on torn paper. Some of us were always watching. Thank you. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't need to. I stood at the window with the nameplate in hand, letting the soft hum of the outside world blend with the weightless hush inside me. My phone buzzed one more time. Voicemail from Indira. I deleted it without listening, because silence doesn't mean I forgave you. It just means I've moved on. It had been a week since I walked out of that boardroom. 1 week since I watched the entire tower of arrogance wobble under its own weight. Since then, the headlines had gotten sharper, louder, more accurate. Family-owned tech firm faces EU legal firestorm. The Austin Business Journal plastered it across the top fold. I didn't buy the paper, but my neighbor slid it under my door with a yellow sticky note that said, "Saw your name in between the lines." She wasn't wrong. I sat at my desk, coffee cooling on the windowsill, and opened the drive labeled Legacy Vault. It wasn't a backup. It was a blueprint. My blueprint. Inside were the memos they'd ignored, the risk assessments they'd buried, the handoff notes, timeline audits, and, most importantly, the metadata on every single document I ever produced. I had curated each file like a historian preparing for a trial no one believed would come. I uploaded them all to a secure cloud archive and named the folder If Ever Asked, .zip. Documentation isn't revenge, it's protection. Later that morning, a call came from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. Voicemail. 10 minutes later, a text from Indira. "We're locked out of the portal. Can you confirm if you had any 2FA permissions we overlooked?" I replied with a single line. "Check the documentation I submitted last year." Her response came fast. "That folder was cleared after reorg." "Then so was your access," I typed, and sent. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. By noon, someone leaked internal emails. They landed on a public message board where ex-employees still chatted under anonymous names. We didn't anticipate full license expiration. There was no backup plan. Was she really the only one with full contact rights? Online chatter ignited. The company's subreddit went from dormant to flooded. Employees began resigning. Some with long farewell emails. Some without a word. Investors called for audits. I watched it all unfold while eating toast and checking my plants. The basil looked thirsty. I watered it. Later that afternoon, Leora messaged, "They're offering double to rehire mid-levels." I replied, "I was never mid-level." She answered with a heart emoji and nothing more. That was enough. Around 4 p.m., a name I hadn't seen in years popped into my inbox. Philip Denning, retired last spring, used to be EVP of strategy. The only one who ever truly listened when I warned about EU regulation shifts. "Seraphine," his message read, "you were the backbone. We knew it. No one wanted to say it, but they all leaned on you like it was obvious you'd stay." I stared at that line longer than I expected. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to explain. He already knew. They all did. Too late, but still. That night, the sun dipped behind the horizon like it was quietly watching the fire finish what it started. I was just about to shut my laptop when a new email came in. Subject: Speaking offer. Compliance Ethics Summit, Lisbon. No preview text, just a single line inside. "We'd be honored if you'd close the conference. Your name carries weight." I read it 3 times. Smiled, not out of surprise, but recognition. Because when they thought they were shutting me out, they were opening a different door. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Blue light slipping through the blinds, birds competing for airspace outside my window. I sat on the floor of my home office, surrounded by cardboard boxes and pieces of a life I had spent 20 years building. My badge lay at the bottom of the drawer I had just emptied. It still had the faint outline of my thumbprint smudged across the plastic. A half-used sticky note fluttered off the desk and landed near my knee. Red circle. March 3rd. I held it between my fingers for a moment, then placed it in the box with the others. Behind me, Ophelie lingered in the doorway, silent for a while before asking, "Do you regret leaving?" I didn't look up. "I regret staying so long." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Later that day, an email from Taylor landed in my inbox. Subject: I didn't know. The message was short. I didn't realize how deep it went. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner." It was followed by a voicemail from Indira. Her voice was hushed, like she was afraid someone might hear her even in a recording. "You held the structure. We see that now. I just wish I'd—" "Never mind." I didn't reply. I didn't delete them either. I simply filed them under "too late." I hadn't been waiting for apologies. I'd been waiting to not need them. That afternoon, Ophelia and I sat at the kitchen table over lunch. It was just the two of us, grilled cheese and tomato soup, the way she liked it when she was little. "You never yelled," she said out of nowhere. "How did you not explode?" I smiled into my glass of iced tea. Because yelling would have made me easy to dismiss. I didn't need noise to be heard. I needed truth to echo louder than the room. She smiled too. Small, but real. The first time in weeks I'd seen her laugh without hesitation. When she left to meet a friend, I went back to my desk. This time, not to clean, but to create. I opened a new document and started updating my resume. Not because I needed a job, but because I needed to see myself through my own words, not theirs. I rewrote every title, every achievement they'd tried to minimize. I deleted the word support and replaced it with led. I changed assisted to executed. Then I created a new folder, this time with my name. Inside it, I dropped the completed application to the Lisbon Ethics Summit. I wasn't applying to impress anyone. I didn't need their applause. I just wanted to be understood. For once, on my own terms. Before dinner, I drove to the post office. The box sat in the passenger seat next to me. Office keycard, nameplate, a final note. I dropped it through the metal slot with no hesitation. No goodbye party, no farewell email. Just one simple line scribbled on a yellow post-it. Sometimes the silence you leave behind is louder than anything you said. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked patiently on the empty desktop. A notification appeared. Lisbon Summit confirmed. You're our closing keynote speaker. I exhaled slowly. Let's close it the right way. Lisbon's air had a kind of grace that couldn't be replicated. It wrapped around the old stone buildings with soft confidence, like it knew what had survived centuries and didn't need to prove it. I stood just behind the curtain, fingers brushing against the smooth curve of the mic clipped to my collar. No badge, no logo, just my name printed clean on the small placard beside the stage. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. There had been a time I would have rehearsed this speech to death, pored over every word, prepped for every question, memorized statistics down to the decimal. But now, I didn't need to overcompensate. I'd already lived the truth. I just had to say it. When they called my name, the applause felt polite at first, curious, expectant. I stepped into the light. "Good afternoon," I began. Steady, measured. "My name is Seraphine, and I'm here to talk about what it means to be quietly erased, and what happens when silence becomes evidence." I didn't name names. And I didn't need to. The story unfolded exactly as it had. Systemic gaslighting disguised as streamlining. Theft disguised as collaboration. Loyalty exploited as assumed compliance. I talked about how silence had been used as a corporate strategy, how I had watched my contributions stripped, rebranded, resold, and how, in the end, what saved me wasn't confrontation, it was documentation. "The truth doesn't need defending," I said, my voice clear. "It just needs remembering." The room stood up before I even finished. After the talk, I shook hands, smiled graciously, gave no indication that back home, the company I once built compliance for was unraveling in real time. I didn't need to read the headlines to know. Former exec's quiet exit led to 2.5 M in losses. Compliance leader warned them. They ignored her. Cressida had been removed from his role. Not fired. These people never get fired. They're transitioned out, with carefully worded press releases and LinkedIn updates about new adventures, but the board minutes leaked, and they were brutal. Failure to heed internal expertise resulted in systemic breakdown. No lawsuit, no courtroom drama, just the kind of career implosion that happens when your entire reputation is built on borrowed brilliance. That evening, I wandered Lisbon alone. No destination, just the sound of my boots on the cobblestone and the occasional buzz of scooters humming past. I stopped at a small cafe, ordered espresso, and sat facing the street. Ophelia texted me a clip from the summit. "Saw the clips. You looked free." I smiled. "I am. Finally." The next morning, back in Austin, Cressida cleared out his office. They told me later that the envelope was still on his desk when he arrived, No name on it, but he knew. Inside was a copy of the Berlin compliance plan. My name, my timestamp, dated 6 months ago. On the front of the envelope, I had written, "This was never about revenge. This was about proving I never needed to scream to be heard." He opened it, sat there for a long time, they said. I don't know if he cried. I don't care. Back in my Lisbon hotel, I opened my laptop one last time. The video file was already loaded, my keynote cut and edited, ready for upload. I titled it, "The Price of Dismissing Me." I hovered for a second, then I clicked publish. Because some victories aren't loud, but they are final.